Dominic Voss believed he had won. That conviction settled into him like a second spine as his black town car rolled through the wet Manhattan streets toward the Meridian, the kind of hotel that didn't need to advertise because everyone who mattered already knew where it was. The rain fell in clean, indifferent sheets against the tinted glass, and Dominic watched it without seeing it, rehearsing the evening ahead the way a conductor rehearses a symphony he has performed 100 times. The announcement, the handshake with Gerald Bryce, the photographs, the headlines by morning. He had spent 4 years building toward this night, and now it was simply a matter of arriving. Tatum Bryce sat beside him, her perfume sharp and expensive, her blonde hair arranged with the careful precision of someone who understood that appearance was its own form of currency. She was 27, and beautiful in the way that certain objects are beautiful deliberately, completely, without accident. She pressed her fingers against his arm and asked if he was nervous, and Dominic told her that men like him didn't get nervous, and she laughed the way she always laughed at things he said, with her whole throat and none of her eyes. His mother was already at the venue. Constance Voss never arrived with anyone. She arrived ahead of everyone, positioned herself near the room's natural focal point, and waited for the world to orient itself around her. Dominic had inherited her patience, if nothing else. The car stopped. The door opened. A young man with an umbrella materialized from the hotel's canopy, and Dominic stepped out into the edge of the rain with the settled authority of someone who had long ago stopped worrying about getting wet. Tatum took his arm. The cameras at the entrance found them immediately, and Dominic gave them the practiced half-smile of a man accustomed to being photographed. Not grinning, never grinning, but present solid, the expression of someone who had earned the right to be exactly where he stood. Inside, the Meridian's grand ballroom had been transformed for the autumn gala season into something that whispered money without ever shouting it. Pale flowers in arrangements taller than most men, candlelight that cost more per hour than most people earned in a day, a string quartet in the far corner playing something classical and unobtrusive. The air carried the faint mineral scent of good champagne and better cologne, and beneath it, if you knew how to listen, the low electric current of people negotiating futures while pretending to enjoy themselves. This was Dominic's world. He had built his way into it through 12 years of relentless, often ruthless accumulation, and he wore it now like a second skin. Though there were still moments, usually late at night, when he felt the faint ghost of the boy from Bridgeport who had pressed his face against the glass of exactly these rooms and promised himself he would one day stand inside them. He did not examine those moments closely. They were not useful. Constance found him within 3 minutes of his arrival, which was approximately 2 minutes and 50 seconds after she had spotted Tatum on his arm and composed her expression into something that managed to convey both approval and the unspoken reminder that she had been suggesting Tatum Bryce for 2 years before Dominic had finally listened. "You look well." Her voice carried the particular warmth of a woman who loved her son precisely as much as he was useful to her ambitions. She kissed his cheek with the light, dry efficiency of a diplomat. "Gerald arrived 20 minutes ago. He's at the bar with the senator. Give him 15 minutes before you approach. Let him have a drink first. He's always more agreeable with bourbon in him." "I know how to handle Gerald." "You know how to handle Gerald when things are going smoothly." Constance adjusted his pocket square a quarter inch in a direction that made no visible difference. "Tonight is not about smooth. Tonight is about permanent. This merger puts the Voss name in a category it has never occupied before. Don't rush it." Tatum had drifted toward a cluster of women near the flower arrangements, and Constance watched her go with the expression of a jeweler appraising a stone that had been set correctly but could still be lost. "She's suitable," Constance said. "Her father's company is the piece we needed. But suitable is a floor, Dominic, not a ceiling. Remember that." "I always do." He plucked a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "Where's the podium set up?" "East wall. You'll speak at 9. Gerald speaks at 9:15. The contract is in the briefcase in the VIP anteroom. Henderson has it. Sign after the speeches, not before. The sequence matters for the photographs." She touched his arm once briefly, the way a chess player touches a piece before deciding whether to move it. Then she moved away into the crowd, and the crowd parted for her in the small, unconscious way that it always did not, because they feared her exactly, but because something in the geometry of her presence made people feel that standing directly in her path was inadvisable. Dominic sipped his champagne and let his gaze travel the room. He catalogued faces the way other men catalogued assets. The senator useful. The hedge fund manager from the Upper East Side potentially useful. The woman from the Arts Foundation who had been trying to get a meeting with him for 6 months not useful tonight. The room was full and bright and loud with the particular energy of people who believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be, and Dominic felt for the first time since the divorce papers had been signed 8 weeks ago, something that was almost uncomplicated satisfaction. He had not thought about Rosalyn tonight. He had thought about her the first few nights after she left. Not with grief exactly, but with a low, nagging awareness, like a room you've rearranged and keep reaching for furniture that's no longer there. She had been part of his life for 5 years, which was long enough to leave grooves. But the grooves were filling in. Tatum was here. The merger was here. The future was a clean, unobstructed road, and Rosalyn was a detail he had settled efficiently for $6,000 and the cost of a taxi. His mother had called it a bargain. He had called it clean. Neither of them had been wrong. 8 weeks earlier, the rain had been doing the same thing it was doing tonight, falling without apology against the windows of a different room in a different part of Connecticut where the old money kept its libraries paneled in dark wood and its secrets filed behind the third shelf on the left. The Voss estate in Westport had that quality that very expensive homes sometimes acquire after decades of habitation, the settled, almost geological conviction of a place that believed it would outlast everyone inside it. Rosalyn sat in the leather chair across from the desk and held the pen in her hand and did not move. The document in front of her was 11 pages. She had read it 3 times. The first time she had read it for what it said, the second time for what it meant. The third time she read it for what it revealed about the people who had written it, about the architecture of contempt that had gone into every clause, every stipulation, every carefully worded paragraph that stripped 5 years from her life and left her with the procedural language of a terminated contract. The settlement was $6,000. Constance had chosen the number personally. Rosalyn understood that the way she understood the instruction that she was to cease using the Voss name socially within 30 days and the clause requiring her to vacate the premises within 48 hours. These were not legal requirements. They were choreography. They were the vocabulary of a particular kind of cruelty that dresses itself in legal language because legal language has the advantage of sounding final. Henderson, the family lawyer, sat to her left and did not make eye contact. He had the hunched internal posture of a man who had been doing things he found distasteful for long enough that distaste had become indistinguishable from his baseline disposition. He cleared his throat twice. He shifted in his chair. He said without looking up from his own copy of the document that she should initial the bottom of page 4 before signing the last page. Dominic sat across from her with his left hand resting on the arm of the chair and his right hand checking his watch. Not conspicuously, not rudely by his own standards, simply with the air of a man performing a necessary administrative task during a busy week who was conscious of the other items remaining on his schedule. He had his jacket on. He had not taken it off when he came in. That detail had registered somewhere in Rosalyn's mind and stayed there, small and specific and more devastating than anything he could have said. Behind him stood Constance. Constance wore a cream blouse and the strand of pearls she wore to every significant occasion of her adult life, the same pearls she had worn to Dominic's graduation, to his first major acquisition announcement, and now to the legal dissolution of his first marriage. There was something almost ceremonial in the consistency of it. She stood with her shoulders back and her chin at the precise angle of a woman who was not gloating, because gloating was undignified, but who was allowing the full weight of her satisfaction to exist in the room without making any effort to conceal it. "Sign it, Rosalyn." Her voice carried the effectless sharpness of a command issued so many times it no longer required emphasis. "Don't draw this out. We all know what you're calculating." Rosalyn looked up. Her eyes were dry. She had finished crying 3 nights ago in the bathroom of the guest bedroom, where she had been sleeping since the night she found them finished crying with the abrupt, almost physical finality of a door closing. And since then, there had been something else in its place, something she didn't have a word for yet but could feel like a weight behind her sternum, cold and very heavy, and not yet moving. "I'm not calculating anything." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I don't want alimony." Dominic looked up from his watch. His expression shifted from impatience to wariness in the way that expressions sometimes do when they encounter something that doesn't fit the script. "Rosalyn, I don't want the Westport property. I don't want the apartment on Park Avenue. I don't want the car." She looked down at the document. "I want what's in here. I want to leave." Constance made a small, sharp sound that was not quite a laugh. "She's performing." She said it to the room, not to Rosalyn directly, the way you narrate a behavior you find both predictable and faintly contemptible. She thinks dignity is a negotiating position. Rosalyn picked up the pen and signed her name in the space on the last page, and then initialed the bottom of page 4, and then closed the folder and placed it on the desk with a steadiness that surprised even herself. The room was quiet for a moment. Constance reached for the folder immediately. She opened it and ran her eyes across the pages with the rapid, suspicious thoroughness of someone who had won too many times to trust a victory that came too easily. When she had verified the signatures, the satisfaction that crossed her face was the specific satisfaction of a person who has carried a certainty for years and now holds it confirmed in black ink. Finally, she exhaled the word like she was setting down something heavy. 5 years, Dominic. I told you 5 years ago." Dominic stood and buttoned his jacket. He looked at Rosalyn with an expression that she recognized. It was the expression of a man who had decided that guilt was a complexity he couldn't currently afford, and had therefore converted it into something else, something more manageable, a species of condescension dressed as concern. "It's better this way, Roz. You were never really comfortable here. You'll be happier." Rosalyn stood. She was wearing a beige trench coat and dark slacks and flat shoes. Because she had packed practical things, things that traveled well, things that did not belong to a life she was no longer living. To the people in that room, she simply looked plain, the kind of woman who had briefly occupied a space designed for someone else and was now sensibly returning to her correct category. She looked at Constance, not with anger. Anger had a heat in it that required fuel, and she had nothing left to give that room. She looked at her with the clear, absolute attention of someone committing a face to permanent memory, filing it under a heading that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with accounting. "Goodbye, Constance." The words came out clean and cold. "I hope it was worth what it cost you. You don't know yet what that number is." She walked out of the library without looking back at the staircase or the chandelier or the landscape painting in the foyer that she had always quietly hated. The front door opened and she stepped into the rain. The taxi was waiting at the gate, engine running. She got in wet to the collar and sat for a moment without speaking. The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror with the careful, incurious expression of a man who had seen all kinds of passengers in all kinds of conditions and had learned not to editorialize. She reached into the inner pocket of her trench coat and found the phone. Not the iPhone that Voss Capital's account paid for monthly. That phone was in the library on the desk where she had left it deliberately next to the folder. This was a different phone, a simple one she had purchased with cash from a drugstore in New Haven 3 days ago, the day after she had made a decision that she had been approaching slowly from a great distance for longer than she could honestly calculate. She dialed a number she had not dialed in 5 years. It rang once. Twice. The voice that answered was deep and unhurried, with the precise, unruffled quality of a man who did not own a single object that had ever startled him. "This is the Caldwell private line." "Grandpa." The word came out differently than she intended, not composed, not steady, but real. The first real thing she had said out loud in 3 days. "It's me. I'm done." There was a pause. Not the pause of surprise. The pause of a man choosing his first words with the same care he applied to everything. "The car has been at the gate since Tuesday, Rosalyn." His voice settled around her like something structural. It was beginning to worry the driver. She almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and a breath. "Come home," Harlan Caldwell said. And then because he was a man of precise language who did not use words decoratively, "It's time." The Caldwell estate in Greenwich was not the kind of place that announced itself. The driveway was long and unwinding, passing through a stand of oak trees that were older than the house, and the house itself, a three-story federal-style structure in pale stone, presented a face to the world that was correct and composed and utterly unrevealing of the fact that the man who lived inside it controlled more capital than most countries collected in annual revenue. Rosalyn Caldwell was 78 years old and had the particular physical authority of men who have spent their lives in rooms where the stakes were real. He was not tall, but he occupied space the way certain buildings occupied space, with a gravitational completeness that made the area around him feel organized in relation to his presence. He used a cane now on the right side after a hip surgery 2 years ago that he had mentioned to no one except his surgeon and his housekeeper. His eyes were gray and sharp, and gave the impression of processing information at a speed slightly faster than the pace of the conversation they appeared to be participating in. He was standing at the door when the car arrived. He did not rush to her. He waited the way he had always waited, with the patience of a man who understood that the moment would arrive at its own proper time and that rushing it accomplished nothing except the loss of composure. Rosalyn walked up the stone steps and into the first real embrace she had experienced in longer than she was able to accurately track. He held her the way he had always held her, not with the careful, performative warmth of someone demonstrating affection, but with the complete, uncomplicated solidity of someone who had decided long ago that this particular person was worth protecting and had not reconsidered since. "You're cold," he said. "It's raining. Come inside." Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and old books, and the specific, unduplicatable scent of permanence of a place that had been inhabited by the same family through enough decades that the building itself had absorbed their particular way of being in the world. Rosalyn had grown up in these rooms. She had learned to read in the library at the end of the East Wing. She had eaten dinner at the long table in the dining room on every major holiday until she was 22 years old, when a Tuesday in October had rearranged everything she understood about the word family and the word future and the word loss. She had left afterward. Not immediately. Immediately she had been incapable of leaving anywhere. But eventually, as the acute phase of grief became chronic and chronic, became the texture of ordinary life, she had found that she could not stay in a world defined entirely by what she came from. She had wanted to know what she was when stripped of the name and the money and the accumulated weight of a lineage that had been building itself since before she was born. She had wanted to be chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with the Caldwell balance sheet. She had found Dominic in a library of all places, which should perhaps have told her something about the fundamental instability of the project from the start. Harlan poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of her at the kitchen table and sat down across from her without preamble. He looked at her with the direct, unsentimental attention of a man conducting an assessment. "Tell me where you are," he said. "Tired." She turned the glass in her hands. "Angry. Not yet at the right person. You're still angry at yourself. For believing him. Believing people who are lying to you is not a character flaw," Harlan said. "It is a consequence of being someone who tells the truth. The people who never get deceived are the people who already assume the worst of everyone. I don't think you want to be that person." She was quiet for a moment. "He knew who I was." The words landed in the kitchen air and stayed there. She had not said them out loud before. She had thought them, had turned them over in the 3 days since she found Constance's email in the drawer of Dominic's home office, the email sent in the first year of their marriage, the one that laid out in Constance's characteristic efficient prose exactly what the arrangement was and what it was designed to achieve. But saying them out loud was different from thinking them. Saying them out loud made them an established fact rather than a wound. "He knew when he sat down in that library," she said. "He had already researched me. It wasn't chance." Harlan set his glass down. His expression did not change in any way she could have described precisely, but something shifted behind his eyes, a quality of deliberate stillness that she recognized as the way he looked when he was choosing not to say something he had already decided to say at a later, more appropriate moment. "He knew," Harlan confirmed. "He knew from the day you met. The kitchen clock measured out several seconds. "How long have you known?" she asked. "2 years." He said it without apology and without defensiveness, the simple declaration of a fact that he had been carrying and had now set down in the correct place at the correct time. "I had people looking at his finances after the first year. The patterns weren't right. The Series A round had structures that didn't reconcile cleanly. I asked Fletcher to go deeper." Fletcher Ames. Her grandfather's lawyer, and in the earlier years of her life, something like a family fixed point. The person who showed up at every significant juncture with a briefcase and a calm so complete it functioned as a form of reassurance. She had not spoken to Fletcher in 5 years either. "You watched for 2 years," Rosalyn said. "Not an accusation, a recalibration." "I watched because you hadn't asked me to act." He folded his hands on the table. "You went into that life because you needed to go into it, because you needed to find out for yourself whether you could be known as a person rather than a name. That mattered. I was not going to take that from you by intervening before you were ready." "And now?" Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the rain had shifted to the lighter, steadier fall of a storm settling in for the night. The oak trees moved against the window glass in slow, deliberate arcs. "Now Fletcher has everything, and everything is considerable." He paused. "The question isn't whether you have the tools, Rosalyn. The question is what you want to build with them." She thought about the $6,000 check which she had left on the desk next to the iPhone. She thought about the clause requiring her to stop using the name Voss, which had not troubled her at all because Voss had never been a name she wore comfortably. It had always been someone else's name, a garment she had borrowed and never quite altered to fit. She thought about Constance's voice in the library and the unhurried way Dominic had checked his watch and the specific weight of 5 years spent making herself smaller in increments so gradual she had almost not noticed the cumulative reduction, until the morning she stood in the bathroom mirror and could not find in the person looking back at her the shape of the person she remembered being. "I want to begin," she said. The 6 weeks that followed were not a montage. Rosalyn had no patience for transformation as theater for the sequence of meaningful glances and determined strides and swelling music that implies that reinvention is primarily an emotional event. What followed was work. Specific, methodical, often tedious work, the kind that happens in offices and over documents and in conversations that require absolute precision of language and zero tolerance for imprecision. Fletcher Ames met her on the second day in the conference room of his firm's building on Lexington Avenue, with 4 accordion files and a laptop and the same unshakable composure she remembered from childhood. He was 46, with the face that suggested he had seen most varieties of human complexity and had long ago stopped being surprised by any of them, and he greeted her with the particular warmth of someone who had genuinely been waiting for a phone call and was pleased that it had finally come. He walked her through the Caldwell Financial Group holdings with the patient thoroughness of a guide who understands that the person standing next to him is not a tourist, but a returning native, someone who needs orientation, not instruction. The number was $2.8 billion in assets under direct management, with adjacent holdings in private equity and real estate that pushed the effective net worth considerably higher. Harlan had not grown it dramatically in her absence. He had maintained it, protected it, kept it from the kind of attrition that afflicts fortunes tended by people without his particular species of careful attention. There was also an envelope. Fletcher placed it at the end of the table and explained without elaboration that Harlan had prepared it 2 years ago and asked that it be given to her when she was ready. Inside were the documents on Dominic Voss's Series A capital raise in 2019. The structure was complex and would have required a sophisticated reader to follow, which was, Fletcher explained, precisely the point. Nested within 4 layers of LLC ownership was a collateralization of assets from the Caldwell Trust that Rosalyn had accessed for Dominic's use in 2018, a fund transfer of $380,000 for graduate tuition company seed capital and the deposit on the Park Avenue apartment. Those assets had been used by Dominic as implicit collateral in representations made to Series A investors, representations that strongly implied a backing that had never been formally authorized. The SEC's rules on material omissions in capital raises were unambiguous. It was not merely a civil matter, It was a federal one. Rosalyn read through the documents twice and then a third time, and then she sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and what she felt was not the satisfaction she might have expected. What she felt was the specific clarifying sensation of something that had been slightly out of alignment for years finally clicking into its correct position. The feeling not of anger fulfilled, but of reality accurately perceived. "How long until the Voss-Bryce merger closes?" she asked. Fletcher looked at his notes. 6 weeks from today. The gala announcement is scheduled for October 23rd. They signed the formal agreement at the event. She thought about that. 6 weeks was a specific kind of interval, long enough to be methodical, short enough to demand efficiency. It was the length of a campaign, not a war. "What does Harrington Credit Partners look like from the outside?" she asked. Fletcher allowed himself a small, controlled expression that in a less composed man would have been a smile. "Like a mid-sized private credit fund with unremarkable performance and no notable public presence, which is exactly what it was designed to look like. And from the inside? From the inside, it holds $160 million of Voss Capital's senior debt across 3 facilities, all of which contain standard default and acceleration clauses." He paused. "Harlan acquired it 14 months ago. He said at the time that it was a precautionary measure, that he hoped it would never be relevant." Rosalyn picked up the pen on the table. She set it down again. "What would trigger the acceleration clause?" "A material adverse event, or more relevantly for our purposes, documented evidence of fraud in the original equity raise, which would constitute a breach of the lender representations in the 2019 facility agreement. And if I filed the SEC complaint first, the filing itself would constitute a reportable event under the facility terms. The debt would be immediately callable." She looked at Fletcher for a moment. He looked back at her with the same steady, unreadable attention. "He thought he settled me for $6,000, she said. Fletcher picked up his pen and opened a clean legal pad. "Where would you like to start?" The Sotheby's auction was not part of the original plan. It became part of this plan on a Thursday afternoon when Fletcher mentioned in passing that Gerald Bryce Tatum's father, the CEO of Bryce Industries, and the other party to the merger, Dominic was about to announce, would be attending a fall sale at the New York Rooms in 9 days to bid on a Sargent portrait that his late wife had admired. Rosalyn had spent 20 minutes with the auction catalog and decided that it was in fact the correct next step. She arrived at Sotheby's in a charcoal suit and took a seat 3 rows behind Gerald Bryce, who was a heavy-set man in his mid-60s with the confident impatience of someone who was not accustomed to competition. She waited through 4 lots. She watched the room with the peripheral attention she had spent the past 5 weeks deliberately reactivating the ability to read a space, to track the invisible currents of who deferred to whom and why, to understand the social physics of a room without appearing to. When Lot 23 came up, the bidding started at $8 million and moved with the quick, almost mechanical efficiency of a room full of people for whom $8 million was an entry price rather than a ceiling. Bryce was aggressive. He had the posture of a man who had decided he was going to leave with this painting before he walked in the door. Rosalyn let him drive the bidding to $22 million. Then she raised her paddle. She watched his shoulders tighten. She watched him bid 24. She matched it immediately without hesitation, which she knew from experience was more unsettling than a slow counter-bid. The immediate match communicated that the ceiling had not been reached and would not be reached before he found his own limit. At $26 million, Gerald Bryce set his paddle down and turned in his seat to see who was behind him. She stood before he could fully turn. She walked to his row and stopped at his aisle seat and looked down at him with the calm, direct attention of someone who has no reason to be nervous because they have already done all the preparation that nervousness is designed to compensate for. "Mr. Bryce." Her voice was even. "Before your merger with Voss Capital closes, you should ask Dominic Voss to show you the unredacted capitalization table from his 2019 Series A, the version that went to the SEC. Then ask him to explain the difference." Gerald Bryce looked at her with the carefully calibrated attention of a man who had been in enough rooms to know when something being said to him was important. "Because the version that went to investors," she said, contains representations about asset backing that don't reconcile with the source documents. I have the wire transfers, and so now does the SEC. She turned and walked back to her seat. She did not watch him reach for his phone. She did not need to. The evening before the gala, the penthouse on Fifth Avenue had the particular quiet of a space that had been prepared and was now simply waiting. Rosalyn stood at the window looking out at the park, at the dark mass of the trees against the orange-lit sky, and thought about nothing specific. Fletcher was at the table behind her with his laptop and the documents and the careful, methodical thoroughness that she had come to rely on over the past 5 weeks. The way you rely on good architecture, not emotionally, but structurally. "Tatum Bryce doesn't know," Fletcher said without looking up. It was not new information he had told her 3 days ago, but he was saying it again because he wanted her to have it present. "I know. She genuinely believes Dominic is in love with her. The email records are unambiguous. She's been deceived by both her father and by him. She's not part of the design." "I know Fletcher." He was quiet for a moment. "I mention it because the plan as structured will be devastating for her publicly regardless of intent." Rosalyn turned from the window. "Then we make sure that what lands on her is the truth, not the collateral damage. She deserves to know what she was to both of them. That's not destruction. That's information she has a right to." Harlan came in from the corridor with 2 glasses of water and set one on the table near Fletcher and brought the other to Rosalyn without comment. He stood beside her for a moment looking out at the park. "Your grandmother used to say," he said, "that you can tell the character of a decision by what you're willing to protect while you're making it." Rosalyn picked up her water. Outside the park held its dark, enormous patience. Tomorrow night, 400 people would stand in a ballroom and watch the architecture of the last 5 years fall apart with the sudden, irreversible completeness of something that was always going to fall, that had been built on a fault line from the first day. She was not happy about this. She was not unhappy about it either. She was clear about it, which was different from both. She went to the closet and took out the dress. Midnight navy floor length, the fabric precise and unshowy. Not the dress of someone trying to impress, but the dress of someone who had decided with complete calm exactly who she was. She had found it on a Tuesday in a shop on Madison Avenue and had known immediately that it was correct, the way you sometimes know a thing is correct before you can explain why. It was the same navy as the suit her grandmother had worn on every occasion that called for an irrevocable decision which Rosalyn had once asked her about and been told with the dry affection of a woman who had lived a long time and found most explanations insufficient. Some colors are just for serious days. Tomorrow was a serious day. She hung the dress back in the closet and turned off the light and went to bed. And if she lay awake for a while looking at the ceiling, it was not because she was afraid. It was because she was paying attention. There is a difference, and she had learned in the last 5 years and most acutely in the last 5 weeks to know it. The Meridian Ballroom on the night of October 23rd was at its fullest at 8:45, that specific pitch of a large event that has achieved critical mass, but not yet the exhausted thinning of a party running past its natural end. 400 guests an evening where 8 figures of net worth per person if you averaged it across the room and chose your methodology generously, a senator and 2 federal judges and the president of a major university and a former Secretary of State who now sat on 6 boards. The kind of room, in other words, that New York produced in the fall every year with the reliable efficiency of a city that understood its own primary function. Dominic stood near the bar with a bourbon and the pleasant, expansive confidence of a man at the center of an evening he had constructed to confirm everything he believed about himself. Tatum was with a group near the east wall laughing at something. His mother was positioned near the podium, reviewing the evening's sequence with the hotel's events coordinator, with the focused proprietary energy of a woman who considered any gathering she attended to be in some important sense hers. The double doors at the far end of the ballroom opened at 8:52. Later, the people who were standing near enough to see it happen clearly would describe the moment differently depending on what they noticed first. Some would mention the man Rosalyn Caldwell, 78 years old, suit gray and precise cane in his right hand, moving across the threshold with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who understood that the room's attention would come to him and not the reverse. Some would mention the way the crowd reacted to him before they had time to think about it. The instinctive realignment, the small, unconscious adjustments of posture and proximity that a certain category of presence produces in a room full of people who have spent their careers learning to identify where the actual power is. But most of them in the end would say they noticed her first. She stepped into the light a half-beat behind Harlan, and the room shifted in a way that was not like anything so simple as a hush. It was more like a recalibration, a collective involuntary reassessment of where to direct attention. The dress was midnight navy and fell without drama to the floor, and the diamonds at her throat were real and cold and precise, and her hair, which Constance had spent 4 years requiring her to pin back a small daily erasure disguised as a preference, fell in dark waves past her shoulders with the easy authority of something that had always been correct and had simply been waiting for permission. She did not look around the room. She looked forward with the steady locating attention of someone who arrived at an event knowing exactly where in the space the person they came to find would be standing. Across the room, Dominic Voss looked up. The champagne glass in his hand tilted. He caught it before it fell, but not before the champagne sloshed a small, barely visible loss of control that several people near him noticed and filed away. "Who is that?" Tatum was suddenly at his elbow, her voice carrying the particular tonal mix of admiration and unease that beautiful women sometimes deploy when confronted with another kind of beauty that operates in a register they don't have access to. Dominic didn't answer. His mouth had done something that he was not controlling, a slight opening, a quality of arrested motion, like a machine that has received an input it was not designed to process. Rosalyn Caldwell's voice carried across the room with the clean, unforced projection of a man who had been speaking in large spaces for 60 years and had never once felt the need to raise it. "Shall we, Rosalyn Caldwell?" The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Rosalyn Caldwell. Not Voss. Not the name on the divorce papers. The name she had been born with, the name attached to one of the oldest financial institutions in the Northeast. The name that the senator across the room had just visibly reacted to the slight forward inclination of a man recalibrating the significance of the evening he was attending. She took Harlan's arm. Her fingers rested in the crook of his elbow with the settled naturalness of someone who had come home, and the two of them moved into the room, and the room continued to part around them. And Rosalyn's gaze moved forward with that same clear, direct measuring attention until it found Dominic's face across the length of the ballroom. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply looked at him the way you look at an equation that is finally resolved, the way you look at a number that has finally revealed what it actually represents. And then she raised her chin barely by a fraction of a degree in the way that contains an entire acknowledgement while conceding absolutely nothing. Dominic Voss had spent 12 years learning what power looked like in a room. He had studied it, cultivated it, purchased approximations of it. He understood in the specific bone-deep way of a man confronting something he can neither dismiss nor absorb that what had just walked through those doors was not an approximation. His hand found the bar behind him for balance. At the podium near the east wall, Constance Voss had turned at the sound of the name, and what crossed her face was not the controlled architectural composure she had maintained for 40 years of difficult social situations. It was something rawer and more specific, the expression of a woman who has played a long, careful game and has just understood in one single instant that she has been playing it on the wrong board. The music from the string quartet, which had been unobtrusive all evening, continued. The candles burned. The champagne was poured and poured again. And in the center of it all, Rosalyn Caldwell moved through the room that had never been Constance's and had never been Dominic's, the room that had simply been waiting with the patient certainty of all large spaces for the correct person to inhabit it. She chased nothing. She hurried for no one. She had arrived. The first thing Constance did was recover her posture. It took her approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which the room around her continued its ambient noise. The string quartet continued its unobtrusive work, and 400 guests continued the delicate performance of pretending they had not just witnessed something that would be discussed at dinner tables and in elevator banks for the next 3 weeks. Constance pulled her shoulders back, reset her chin to its customary angle, and turned away from the sight of Rosalyn moving through the ballroom on Rosalyn Caldwell's arm, with the deliberate composure of a woman reclaiming territory she had temporarily vacated. The recovery was impressive. It was also, from Rosalyn's peripheral awareness, completely transparent, the visible effort of a woman whose primary skill had always been the management of appearances, deploying that skill in the one situation where appearances had already been irreversibly altered. Dominic had not moved from the bar. He stood with his bourbon held slightly away from his body, as though he had forgotten it was in his hand, and watched Rosalyn cross the room with an expression that cycled through several distinct phases in rapid succession. Disbelief, calculation, something that might have been a vestigial impulse toward charm, and then something underneath all of it, something older and less managed, that looked almost like the face of a man who has just understood the shape of the trap he is standing in and is simultaneously awed by its construction. Tatum had stopped asking questions. She had the sharp social instinct of someone raised in rooms like this one, and she understood that she was standing next to a man who was no longer entirely present, that something had just changed in the gravitational field of the evening, and that the correct response was to be very still and very watchful until she understood the new geometry. Rosalyn and Harlan stopped in front of them. The 4 feet of ballroom floor between the two parties held a silence that had nothing to do with the volume of the room around it. The music played, people talked, glasses clinked, and in the middle of all of it this small pocket of absolute stillness, like the eye of something large and organized. Dominic found his voice first, which was instinct rather than advantage. Rosalyn. He shaped it into something that was almost casual, almost the tone of a man encountering a pleasant surprise, but it came out with a slight crack in the foundation, the way a wall sounds when you tap it and find the hollow space behind the plaster. "You look different." She looked at him with the measuring attention she had been practicing for 34 years, the attention that her grandmother had called simply seeing clearly, and what she saw was a man wearing a very good suit and a set of assumptions that were about to become liabilities. "Dominic." Her voice was unhurried, neither warm nor cold, the temperature of a fact stated without editorial. "You look exactly the same. That's a problem." He blinked. Tatum's grip on his arm tightened imperceptibly. Harlan had not spoken since his introduction of Rosalyn at the door. He stood beside her with the particular stillness of a man who has no need to establish dominance in a room because the room has already made its own assessment. He looked at Dominic Voss with the patient, unimpressed attention of someone reviewing a financial instrument that has underperformed its projections for years and is now simply waiting to be written off correctly. Before Dominic could recalibrate enough to produce a follow-up, Constance arrived. She materialized at Dominic's shoulder with the quick, purposeful movement of a woman who had decided that whatever was happening needed her management immediately. She looked at Rosalyn with an expression that was attempting to reassemble itself into the familiar architecture of contempt, but was encountering structural problems. "Rosalyn." Constance said the name the way she had always said it, with a slight, almost imperceptible flattening of the vowels, the verbal equivalent of a woman placing her thumb on a scale. "What a surprise." "I imagine it is." Rosalyn did not elaborate. There was a specificity to her restraint, the kind of silence that is not empty but loaded, that makes the other person feel the pressure of everything not being said. Constance pivoted, which was her nature. When one approach lost its footing, she moved. "Well," she smoothed the front of her jacket with both hands, a gesture Rosalyn had watched her make 500 times in 5 years, Constance's tell-the-micro movement she produced when she was buying 3 seconds to construct the next sentence. "It's lovely that you could come, though I do have to say the Caldwell name is a bit theatrical as an entrance." A small dry laugh. "Is that what we're doing tonight? Theater?" Harlan Caldwell turned his head slowly with the considered, unhurried movement of a man for whom the concept of rushing did not exist, and looked at Constance directly for the first time. He did not say anything. He simply looked at her with gray eyes that had watched markets rise and collapse, and watched men who believed themselves powerful discover that they had been operating on borrowed authority the entire time. Constance stopped talking. It was not a dramatic silencing. It was more like the sudden cessation of a sound you hadn't consciously noticed until it was gone, and then in its absence the room felt different, and you understood it had been present all along. Rosalyn touched Harlan's arm lightly. "We should find our seats." She looked at Dominic one final time with the clean, unhurried attention of someone completing an inventory. "Enjoy your evening, Dominic, while it's still yours." They moved away. Behind her, she could hear Tatum's voice, low and urgent. "Who is Rosalyn Caldwell?" And Dominic's response, which was not a response at all, but a silence that had weight and texture and the specific quality of a man standing in an open field, realizing for the first time that the sky has changed. At 9 o'clock, Constance took the podium. She had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness she brought to all significant performances, and the performance was technically precise, her voice at the correct pitch, her diction clear, her posture conveying the exact blend of maternal pride and institutional authority she had been cultivating for decades. She spoke about innovation in American industry. She spoke about the vision required to build something lasting. She used the phrase "the Voss legacy" twice, which she had decided in advance was the maximum number of times that phrase could appear in a single speech without becoming ostentatious. And then, because she could not entirely resist it, because the presence of Rosalyn in the room had lodged under her skin like a splinter, and the podium was a platform, and she had always believed that the best defense was a conspicuous offense. She paused, scanned the room with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to having audiences, and said that every great enterprise requires a clarity of purpose, a willingness to release what no longer serves the vision. That there had been an unfortunate chapter in her son's life, she let that phrase sit for exactly the right number of beats, but that what followed was always more defining than what preceded it. That they were here tonight to celebrate a future built correctly with the right foundations, the right partnership. The room received this with the mixed, slightly uncomfortable energy of people who understood they were witnessing something personal being performed as something institutional and were not entirely sure where to direct their attention. Rosalyn, seated at a table in the center of the room, listened to all of it. Fletcher was to her left. Harlan was to her right. She held her water glass and let Constance finish, and then set the glass down and turned slightly in her chair toward Fletcher and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "Now." Fletcher's hand moved under the table. On his laptop in the anteroom off the main corridor, 2 keystrokes confirmed the instruction to the venue's AV technician who had been hired by Caldwell Financial Group 6 days ago and whose arrangement with the hotel's regular production team had been handled with the careful invisibility of a decision made by people who understood that the best operations are the ones no one sees until the moment they are designed to produce. The LED screen behind the podium, which had been displaying the Voss-Bryce merger logo throughout the evening, went dark. Constance was mid-sentence. The screen resolved. White letters on dark blue, clean and unadorned, Caldwell Financial Group. New York, Boston, Chicago. The room did not gasp. It produced something more interesting than a gasp, a collective intake that was part breath, part recalculation, the sound of 400 people simultaneously revising the significance of the evening they were attending. Constance turned. She looked at the screen with an expression that cracked along its careful seams, the composure fracturing not all at once but in sequence, first the eyes, then the set of the mouth, then the rigid architecture of the shoulders, softening degree by degree into something that was no longer performance. "What is this?" The microphone carried it across the room. Not loud, almost a whisper, which made it worse. Rosalyn was already standing. She walked to the podium the way she had crossed the board meeting 12 days earlier, and the auction room 9 days before that, not quickly, not slowly, but with the deliberate economy of motion of someone for whom the destination is certain and the route already walked in every meaningful sense before the first physical step was taken. The room tracked her. It couldn't help it. There is a quality to certain kinds of presence that operates below the threshold of deliberate attention, and Rosalyn had stopped suppressing hers somewhere in the 3rd week of preparation when she had understood that suppression had never been modesty and had never been chosen. It had been managed out of her increment by increment over 5 years of being told in 100 small and precise ways that the version of herself that took up less space was the more appropriate one. She stopped at the podium, Constance did not move immediately, which produced a moment of visible, awkward stasis. Two women at a microphone, one of whom had just been delivering a speech and one of whom was simply waiting for the podium with the patient certainty of someone who knows time is currently working in her direction. Constance stepped back. Rosalyn looked out at the room. 400 faces turned toward her with the particular alertness of people who understand that whatever they are about to witness is not on the program. 5 years ago. She began, her voice even and unhurried, carrying in the high-ceilinged room with the clean projection of someone who had spent a month relearning how to speak in a register that was not diminished. A woman used her grandmother's trust fund to pay for a man's graduate education, $380,000. She also provided the seed capital for his first company and the deposit on the property he currently owns on Park Avenue. She paused for exactly one beat. She asked for one thing in return, not credit, not acknowledgement. She asked for honesty. She received a $6,000 check and 30 days to stop using his name. The room was absolutely still. Behind her the screen shifted. Wire transfer records, dates and amounts and account numbers rendered in the clean, legible format of financial documentation projected large enough to be read from the back of the room. The transfers bore Rosalyn's name on the sending line and Dominic's on the receiving end, and the dates corresponded precisely to the timeline she had described. They corresponded more critically with representations made in the Voss Capital Series A, offering documents, representations that had characterized the company's founding capital as entirely self-generated. The man being celebrated tonight did not build Voss Capital alone. Her voice did not change temperature or pace. It had the quality of a legal brief read aloud, each sentence specific, documented, not an allegation, but a record. He built it on a foundation that belonged to someone else, and he built it by making representations to investors that did not reflect that reality. Another pause. As of this morning, I have filed a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission documenting the material omissions in the 2019 Series A offering. The complaint includes the wire transfer records you're looking at now, along with the capitalization table discrepancies identified in a Goldman Sachs audit completed last week. Across the room, Gerald Bryce had his phone in his hand. He was not discreet about it. Dominic stood near the bar where he had been standing all evening, and the bourbon was still in his hand, and his face had done something that was not quite any single expression, but contained traces of several, the particular composite of a man watching the structure of an argument he had believed was sound collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Rosalyn reached into the folder that Fletcher had placed on the podium before the event. The folder she had carried into the room as a document rather than a prop. She removed a single page and held it up. Voss Capital currently carries $160 million in senior debt across 3 credit facilities. That debt is held by Harrington Credit Partners. She let the name exist in the room for a moment. 9 days ago, Harrington Credit Partners was acquired by Caldwell Financial Group. The page in her hand was the acquisition confirmation bearing Harlan's signature and the date. Which means the debt is mine. The default clauses in the facility agreements are mine, and the acceleration rights triggered by the SEC filing I made this morning are mine. Gerald Bryce stood up. He stood up the way large, heavy men stand when they have just processed information that requires an immediate change of position, not gracefully with a slight awkward push of both hands against the table. He was already speaking into his phone before he had fully straightened. His face had the specific color of a man who has just understood that a transaction he considered settled has revealed itself to be something else entirely. Tatum. Bryce watched her father stand up, and something moved across her face, a rapid sequential understanding. The kind that arrives not as a single revelation, but as a series of smaller pieces, suddenly assembling into a shape that was there all along. She looked at Dominic. He was not looking at her. "The Voss-Bryce merger is void," Rosalyn continued. "The accounts are frozen pending the federal review, and the contractual guarantee that Dominic Voss signed last month on Bryce Industries' debt. Something my analysts found in the public lender filings means that Voss Capital's exposure extends beyond its own balance sheet." She closed the folder. The screen behind her went dark. "I'm not here tonight to perform a grievance. I'm here because the people in this room deserve to know what they're invested in, what they're partnering with, and who they're doing business with. That information is now available." She stepped away from the podium. The room broke open. Not all at once, first in pockets, the quick, urgent conversations of people whose professional interests had just been materially affected, then in wider currents as the understanding of the evening's full scope propagated through the crowd. Phones materialized everywhere, the universal reflex of people in the presence of breaking news. Gerald Bryce was near the exit, still on his call, his voice tight and controlled and carrying the specific register of a man issuing instructions he wished he'd been able to issue 3 weeks earlier. Constance had not moved from the spot where she had stepped back from the podium. She stood 3 feet to the right of it in the same position with an expression that had passed through several stages of response and had arrived somewhere unexpected. Not rage, which was what Rosalyn might have predicted, but something flatter and more fundamental, like the face of a person watching a building they had been certain was permanent begin to demonstrate otherwise. Dominic reached Rosalyn before she had crossed half the distance back to her table. He moved through the crowd with the urgent, slightly graceless motion of a man for whom the social calculations of the room had collapsed into a single priority. "Rosalyn," his voice was low. The performance of ease was entirely gone. What remained was something unvarnished, not the man she had believed she was marrying, but not the man she had come to understand she had married either. Something in between. Something that might have been the person underneath both of those constructions if such a person existed and was capable of being visible under pressure. "You have to let me explain." She stopped. She looked at him with the level, complete attention of a woman who had been preparing for this specific conversation for longer than she would describe to anyone. "There's nothing to explain, Dominic. The documents explain themselves. The transfers, it wasn't what it looks like. It looks like wire transfers, with dates and amounts and your signature on the receiving accounts." She held his gaze. "I know what it was. I was there." He ran a hand through his hair, the same gesture she noticed as the night she had found him with Tatum. It was his tell, the gesture of a man who has run out of the next prepared sentence. "Did you ever stop to think—" He started and stopped. "Did it ever occur to you that you might have what—" He looked at her for a long moment. And underneath all the calculation and the damage control and the performance of a man trying to find his footing in a conversation he had not scripted, there was something that was possibly genuine, a flash of something that might have been in a different architecture. "Grief. That I actually—" He stopped again. "Don't." Her voice was quiet and final, the tone of closing a door rather than slamming one. "Whatever you were about to say, don't. It won't change the math." She moved past him. Harlan was waiting at the table, sitting straight-backed and unhurried, as though the controlled chaos of the room around him was simply weather. Fletcher had his laptop closed and his jacket on, which meant the filing confirmations had come through and the evening's technical work was complete. Tatum Bryce appeared at the edge of their table. She stood there for a moment without speaking, which took a particular kind of self-possession given the circumstances, given that her father was across the room restructuring his understanding of the last 6 months. Given that the man she had believed loved her was currently somewhere behind her in the crowd, with no version of the evening left to salvage. She was 27 years old, and she had the look of someone who has just walked out of a burning building and is standing on the sidewalk taking stock. She held out a thumb drive. It was small, matte black, unremarkable. She placed it on the table near Rosalyn's water glass with the careful, deliberate motion of someone making a decision they have been carrying for a while. "I found these 3 months ago." Her voice was controlled but not composed. There was a seam running through it, a line where the control was being actively maintained rather than naturally present. "Emails, going back to when you first met him. I didn't know what to do with them." Rosalyn looked at the drive and then at Tatum. The younger woman's face had the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding a difficult truth in a posture of normalcy for longer than it was designed to be held that way. "They planned the introduction," Tatum continued. "His mother found you first. She researched your background, found out about the trust fund, and then arranged for Dominic to be at the library that day. The whole thing was designed." A breath. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't—" She stopped, restarted. I know that doesn't fix what I was part of. I didn't know at the beginning, but I knew enough later and I didn't do anything. So, I'm sorry for that." Rosalyn looked at her for a long moment, not with warmth exactly, but with something that was the precondition for warmth, the willingness to see a person clearly rather than categorically. "You're going to be fine," Rosalyn said. The words were not comfort in the soft sense. They were an assessment delivered by someone who had learned to distinguish between the two. "What your father did with that merger, using you to close a deal without telling you the terms, that has nothing to do with what you're worth." Tatum's mouth did something that was not quite a smile and not quite its opposite. She nodded once. Then she walked away back through the crowd toward whatever version of the rest of the evening remained navigable. Rosalyn picked up the thumb drive and held it for a moment. The emails on this drive, if they documented what Tatum had described, if they confirmed that Constance had orchestrated the introduction before Rosalyn and Dominic had ever spoken, would convert the SEC complaint from a civil and regulatory matter into something with a longer reach. Premeditated financial fraud. A conspiracy with documentation. The kind of case that federal prosecutors found straightforward and juries found easy. She handed the drive to Fletcher without comment. He took it with the unhurried competence of a man who has been waiting for this piece and knows exactly where it fits. Harlan picked up his water glass and considered the room with the patient, unimpressed gaze of a man for whom the outcome had always been a matter of timing rather than uncertainty. "Your grandmother," he said, "would have found the whole evening rather satisfying." "She would have found it efficient," Rosalyn said. "For her, those were the same thing." Across the room, Constance had been joined by the family's lawyer, Henderson, who had the look of a man delivering news that he would have preferred to deliver in a different venue at a different hour. Whatever he was saying had produced in Constance a stillness that was different in quality from her usual stillness, less chosen, less architectural. The stillness of someone who has reached the end of a very long road and found the geography was nothing like the map. Dominic was no longer visible. Somewhere in the ballroom or somewhere beyond it, he was in the process of making phone calls that would not produce the outcomes he needed, having conversations that would not close the gaps that had just opened, running calculations that would not resolve in his favor, no matter how many times he ran them. The string quartet, with the magnificent indifference of professional musicians, was playing something that Rosalyn recognized as late Beethoven, one of the middle quartets. The ones that had always struck her as music about endurance rather than triumph about the particular quality of continuing forward after the terrain has changed irrevocably and the original route is no longer passable. She sat with her grandfather and her grandfather's lawyer in the center of a room that was reorienting itself around a new set of facts, and she felt beneath the precision and the exhaustion and the clean, hard satisfaction of a plan executed correctly, something quieter and more private. Not happiness exactly, something more durable than happiness. The specific low-frequency solidity of a person who has returned to alignment with herself after a long period of being off-axis, who has done the hard, unglamorous work of that return and can now feel the ground under her feet again level and real. She looked at the thumb drive in Fletcher's jacket pocket. The emails it contained would take time to verify, time to build into the formal complaint. But they would hold. She was certain of it in the way she had learned to be certain of things, not through hope, but through preparation. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. She picked up her water glass, and outside the tall windows of the Meridian, the Manhattan night continued its indifferent business, and in a federal filing system, somewhere on a government server, a complaint bearing the date October 23rd sat in its queue, patient and complete, waiting for the morning. The morning after the gala, the headlines were not subtle. The financial press led with the SEC filing because that was the story with the longest institutional reach, the regulatory implications, the investor exposure, the question of how a capital raise had been structured to obscure its actual foundations for 4 years without triggering a review. The general press led with the woman in the midnight navy dress because that was the story with the better photographs. By noon, the two narratives had merged into a single account, circulating across every platform that covered the intersection of money and consequence, and by 3 in the afternoon, Voss Capital's publicly traded debt instruments had moved in the direction that debt instruments move when their underlying guarantor becomes the subject of a federal inquiry. Rosalyn did not read the coverage. Fletcher read it and summarized what was legally relevant, which was his function, and Harlan did not read it at all, which was his nature. The three of them spent the day after the gala in the conference room on Lexington Avenue, where the work of verifying the thumb drive's contents had begun the previous night and was now entering its second phase. The emails were real. This was confirmed by the forensic technology team Fletcher had engaged, who authenticated the metadata within 18 hours of receiving the drive. There were 47 messages between Constance and Dominic spanning the period from 6 weeks before Rosalyn first met him to 14 months into their marriage. They documented in Constance's characteristic, precise, and unsentimental prose the identification of Rosalyn Caldwell as a target, the research into the trust fund structure and its accessibility, the choreography of the library introduction, and the ongoing management of the marriage as an extraction operation with specific references to timelines for accessing the seed capital instructions for maintaining the appearance of a functional relationship through the first 2 years, and a series of messages in year 3 that discussed the optimal timing for dissolution once the company had achieved sufficient independence from its original funding. Reading them, Rosalyn felt something she had not anticipated. Not rage had a heat that required proximity, and she was too far along the road for proximity. What she felt was colder and more clarifying, the specific sensation of an understanding finally made complete. For 5 years she had carried a low-grade uncertainty about her own judgment, the persistent, quietly corrosive question of whether she had simply failed to see what should have been visible. The emails answered that question with the finality of a closed account. She had not failed to see. There had been nothing to see. The performance had been professional and premeditated, conducted by people who had invested significant effort in ensuring it looked exactly like the thing it was designed to mimic. That was not a failure of perception. It was a crime. Fletcher filed the supplemental complaint with the SEC on the 3rd day, incorporating the authenticated emails as exhibits. On the 4th day, the U.S. Attorney's Office made a call to Fletcher's office that was not unexpected. On the 6th day, 2 federal agents arrived at Voss Capital's Midtown offices with documentation requests that were in the vocabulary of federal investigation, the polite opening of a conversation that would become considerably less polite over time. Dominic's lawyers issued a statement. It said what statements issued by lawyers in these circumstances always say that the allegations were without merit, that their client was cooperating fully, that the timing of the complaint was itself evidence of improper motivation. It was a competent statement. It changed nothing. Constance received the notice to vacate on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who rang the bell of the Westport estate at 8:45. The notice offered 48 hours, which was the minimum courtesy period, and had been set at the minimum deliberately. The estate's deed had been transferred into a holding structure as part of Dominic's debt collateralization arrangement, a detail he had apparently not fully disclosed to his mother when he had used it, and Caldwell Financial Group, as the controlling creditor, had the authority to demand vacant possession pending resolution of the debt facilities. Rosalyn was not present for this. She had no interest in witnessing it. She learned about it from Fletcher's 2-sentence summary that evening and filed it in the part of her mind that tracked completed items and moved forward. What occupied her attention that week was the Caldwell Foundation's inaugural board meeting scheduled for the 1st of November and proceeding on schedule regardless of the legal proceedings running in parallel. The Foundation's primary purpose was scholarship funding for women pursuing careers in finance and investment management, a field with its own long institutional history of deciding in 100 small and precise ways that women were a category requiring special justification before being admitted to its full membership. The board meeting lasted 4 hours. Rosalyn chaired it with the same methodical attention she brought to financial analysis. Not the performed ease of someone who had been running meetings since their 20s, but the precision of someone who understood that clarity of process was its own form of respect for the people in the room. By the end of the meeting, the Foundation had an operating budget, a scholarship criteria document, a 3-year strategic plan, and a first cohort of 12 recipients who would be notified the following week. 52 applications had been reviewed in the selection process. Rosalyn read all 52 personally, which Fletcher told her was not necessary, and which she did anyway because necessary had never been the only relevant standard. The federal investigation moved with the particular pace of federal investigations, not slowly exactly, but with a thoroughness that resisted pressure in either direction. By the end of the 4th month, the U.S. Attorney's Office had issued a formal indictment on 3 counts: securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud, the 3rd count arising specifically from the authenticated emails and naming both Dominic and Constance as co-defendants. Constance's lawyers fought the conspiracy count with considerable energy and considerable billable hours. They argued that the emails represented strategic business planning rather than criminal coordination, that the language was ambiguous, that the interpretation being advanced by the prosecution was tendentious. The judge assigned to the case was a 61-year-old former corporate litigator who had spent 20 years watching people describe criminal schemes in the vocabulary of business planning, and she found the arguments unpersuasive. Dominic's lawyers made 3 attempts to negotiate a plea arrangement that would have reduced his exposure significantly in exchange for cooperation against Constance. The U.S. Attorney declined all 3. Fletcher, who had contacts in the federal system, accumulated over 20 years of corporate law, believed the government's case was strong enough to proceed without cooperation, and that the cooperation offered fell short of what a reduction would have required. He believed both things were true simultaneously. Dominic moved out of the Park Avenue apartment in February. He moved into a rental that was perfectly adequate by ordinary standards and conspicuously reduced by the standards of the life he had been living. He was still wealthy. His personal shares had not been seized, only frozen, pending the outcome of the civil proceedings, but wealthy in the quiet, restricted way of someone whose wealth was currently theoretical rather than operational, sitting in accounts he could not access and representing a future contingent on outcomes he could not control. Tatum Bryce provided her testimony to federal investigators in November. She cooperated fully, which her own lawyers had advised, and which she had apparently decided on independently before they advised it. Her cooperation filled in gaps and provided context, and gave the jury, when the time came, the testimony of someone who had been inside the operation without directing it. After the federal interviews, Tatum stepped away from her previous social world quietly and did not step back into it. In the spring, a small gallery opened on a quiet block in Brooklyn. No announcement, no press release, a handwritten sign in the window. Rosalyn learned about it from a brief mention in a local arts publication. She did not visit, but she noted it with something that was not quite admiration, and not quite its opposite, the recognition of someone who had made a choice that cost something real and made it anyway. The trial lasted 11 days. Rosalyn attended 3 of them, the opening statements, and the 2 days that included the financial documentation testimony. She sat in the gallery with Fletcher and watched the jury watch the evidence, and she watched the evidence be what it was: not dramatic, not cinematic, but relentlessly specific. Dates and accounts and signatures and emails and the patient incremental construction of a record that left no meaningful interpretive space. Dominic wore a suit on every day of the trial. He wore it correctly, the right suit for a federal courtroom, the right level of formality. But the suit no longer carried the authority it had carried in the rooms where he had built his career. Authority is not a property of clothing. It is a property of the relationship between a person and the circumstances they inhabit, and those circumstances had changed in ways that no suit could compensate for. Constance sat 2 seats from her son each day. They did not speak during the recesses. They did not look at each other during the testimony. The conspiracy that had bound them had dissolved somewhere earlier in some private moment that had not been witnessed and would not be reported when the full arithmetic of what each of them had chosen and what it had cost had finally been completed, and the distance between them became the only honest thing remaining. The verdict came on the 11th day. Guilty on all counts for Dominic. Guilty on the conspiracy count and the wire fraud count for Constance. The securities fraud count against Constance was not sustained. The jury found insufficient evidence of her direct knowledge of the specific omissions in the investor documents, but the two sustained counts carried sufficient weight for the sentencing guidelines to be significant. Rosalyn was not in the courtroom for the verdict. She was in the Caldwell Foundation's offices, reviewing the second cohort of scholarship applications when Fletcher's text arrived, 3 words their prearranged code for the outcome. She read it and set the phone face down on the desk and looked at the stack of applications in front of her. Then she picked up the application on top and continued reading. Before the sentencing, Harlan called Rosalyn into the library at the Greenwich estate on a Sunday evening in late July. He did not use the library for ordinary conversations. He used it for things that required the weight of a room that had absorbed several generations of difficult decisions, and Rosalyn understood from the fact of being called there, rather than to the kitchen or the terrace, that what he was about to tell her was not administrative. He placed a folder on the desk between them and left his hand resting on top of it for a moment before sliding it toward her. The FBI had reopened the investigation into the 2009 accident. This was the sentence he began with, stated in the level direct tone he used for all significant information, without preamble, without cushioning, because he had long ago concluded that cushioning difficult truths was a form of condescension toward the person receiving them. She had known something like this was coming, not with certainty but with the low, persistent awareness of a person who has spent enough time looking clearly at available facts to recognize when a pattern is present and the conclusion it supports is the only one the evidence accommodates. Her parents had died on a Tuesday in October on a road they drove 3 times a week. The original investigation had called it mechanical failure and closed within 6 weeks. She had been 22 years old, too consumed by grief to ask the questions that grief does not ask. She was 34 now. She had spent the last year relearning what it felt like to ask questions that required the kind of clarity grief does not permit. The vehicle data recorder had been preserved in evidence storage. The original report cited brake failure consistent with mechanical wear. A new forensic analysis conducted using methodology developed in the years since the original investigation found the wear pattern inconsistent with normal degradation. It was consistent instead with accelerated chemical deterioration, which was not a naturally occurring event. She held the folder and did not open it immediately. Outside the library windows, the Connecticut evening was doing what Connecticut evenings do in late July, holding its warmth past the hour. When warmth is expected, the trees absolutely still, the light going amber and slow. "The board member," she said, "the one who opposed my father's restructuring proposal in 2008. "A preservation order was issued last week," Harlan said. "Fletcher will have the full documentation by end of month." She sat with this. Her father had spent the last year of his life trying to restructure Caldwell Financial's governance, trying to reduce the concentration of control in the hands of a small group of senior board members who had been operating with near total autonomy for 2 decades. He had been methodical about it. He had been building consensus, documenting concerns, preparing a formal proposal that would have shifted the balance of power in ways that several people on that board found genuinely threatening to their positions and their arrangements. 7 months after he announced his intention to file the proposal, he and her mother had not come home on a Tuesday in October. The anger that came was not the proximate specific anger of the gala or the board meeting or the months of legal proceedings. It was older and ran deeper, reaching into the part of her that had been grieving for 12 years under the assumption that loss was the correct category for what had happened. Loss implied chance. Loss implied the indifference of the universe, the neutral machinery of accident and circumstance. What the folder in her hands implied was something else, that the people she had been grieving were not taken by chance, but by calculation, by someone who had looked at them the way Constance had looked at her, and performed the same cold arithmetic and arrived at the same conclusion about the acceptable cost of removal. There were no words for that realignment that were adequate to the task. She did not try to find them. "Then we're not finished," she said. Harlan looked at her with the gray eyes that had been looking at her since she was old enough to understand what it meant to be truly seen. "No, we're not finished. But we're beginning from a position that your father never had. Full knowledge, full resources, and a record that demonstrates exactly what this family is capable of when it decides to act. He paused. That matters more than you might think right now. She nodded. She opened the folder and began to read. The sentencing was on a morning in late August when the city had the flat, whitish heat of a summer that had been going on too long. Rosalyn dressed in gray, not the navy, which was for irrevocable decisions, but a lighter gray, the color associated with working mornings, with the ordinary serious business of a day that required attention rather than ceremony. She arrived at the federal courthouse early and sat in the gallery and waited. Dominic received 4 years with the possibility of parole at 30 months plus financial penalties and permanent bars from serving as an officer or director of any SEC-registered entity. The judge read the sentence in the flat, factual tone of someone delivering an outcome rather than a judgment. Efficient and final. Constance received 18 months on the conspiracy count to be served in a minimum security facility in Connecticut. 18 months was a number Rosalyn noted without particular feeling, as a fact the legal system had produced and that she did not have the standing in this moment to dispute. After the sentencing in the corridor outside the courtroom, Dominic's lead attorney approached Fletcher with the request that had been anticipated for several months, whether Rosalyn would be willing to a brief private meeting before his client was remanded. Fletcher relayed the request without recommendation. Rosalyn thought about it for 30 seconds, which was how long it took her to determine that whatever Dominic needed to say was probably insufficient, and that what she needed to do was finish what she had come to finish. 10 minutes, she said. In the conference room. The conference room had the austere utilitarian quality of spaces that exist purely for function, a table, 4 chairs, fluorescent lighting, a window looking at another building's exterior wall. No ceremony, which was correct. This was not a ceremonial moment. Dominic sat across from her. He looked like a man who had lost weight in the way that happens when the structure supporting a person's self-conception has been removed, and the body, uncertain how to compensate, begins subtracting. His eyes were clearer than she remembered from the gala. Clarity is not always an improvement. Sometimes it simply reveals the specific outline of a person who has been stripped of every layer of protective self-narration and is now present with himself in a way that is not comfortable and cannot be managed away. He had prepared something. It was not surviving contact with the actual room. I wanted to explain. He stopped, restarted. At the beginning, before my mother got involved in the details, I want you to know that what I felt, don't reconstruct it, Dominic. Her voice was even. Not unkind. Unkindness would have required energy she had long since redirected. Whatever was real, it doesn't change what was also true. Both things can exist. I've made my peace with that. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conversation too late to change its terms and understands this perhaps for the first time without the protective buffer of self-justification. Did you ever actually... He stopped. The unfinished question hung in the fluorescent light between them. Yes. She said it before he completed the sentence because she knew the question and because the honest answer was the only one she had any use for at this point. That was the tragedy of it. I was the only one in that marriage who did. I loved a version of you that you were performing, and the performance was precise enough that I didn't know the difference for longer than I would like to have taken. She paused. That's partly on me, and partly it's on the people who constructed the performance specifically to be indistinguishable from the real thing. He ran a hand through his hair, the same gesture she noticed as the night she had found him with Tatum and again in the ballroom at the gala. It was the gesture of a man who has exhausted his prepared material and has nothing underneath it. I'm sorry. The 2 words came without the scaffolding of justification or context, just the words sitting in the room with their full weight and nothing borrowed around them. She looked at him steadily. I know you are. That's the difference between you and your mother. She isn't sorry. She's inconvenienced. A pause. The saddest part, and I mean this without cruelty, isn't that you used me. It's that you had access to something real, something that would have been permanent and mutual and worth having, and you chose the transaction instead. Not because you had to, because the transaction was what you understood and real things frightened you, And your mother had been teaching you since before you could argue with her that frightening things should be avoided. She let that settle. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth, as best I can read it. He looked down at the table. He didn't offer a rebuttal, which was, she thought, possibly the most honest thing he had done in her presence. She reached into the folder she had carried in and placed an envelope on the table between them. "That's for you. Don't open it here." She stood. She picked up the folder. "Goodbye, Dominic." The words were not warm and were not cold. They were final in the way that a completed calculation is final, not because emotion has been removed, but because every relevant variable has been accounted for and the result is what it is. "I hope the time does something useful with you." She walked out of the conference room without looking back. In the envelope on the table was a photograph, her wedding day, a candid rather than a posed shot. The two of them mid-laugh at something said off-camera. Genuine laughter caught by a guest's camera before either of them had time to arrange their faces. On the back in her handwriting, $380,000 plus interest recovered in full. We're even. Don't write. The debt was cleared. The accounting was complete. 6 weeks later, on an evening in early October, Rosalyn sat on the stone terrace of the Caldwell estate in the Hamptons and watched the Atlantic hold its enormous patience below the cliff. The ocean at that hour was the color of pewter, going dark, the horizon line between water and sky becoming theoretical, the kind of light that makes distances look both measurable and infinite depending on where you choose to focus. Fletcher came out through the glass doors and sat in the chair to her left. He set the Caldwell Foundation's quarterly report on the stone table between them without announcement, the gesture of a man who has learned that the people he works with prefer information presented directly rather than introduced. She picked it up. The second cohort. 52 scholarships funded. 40 remaining applications held in active consideration for the next cycle. The names on the first page were women she had read about in detail, their circumstances, their ambitions, the particular quality of determination that showed up differently in every application, but was recognizable across all of them, the unmistakable texture of a person who has decided to build something real in a field that has not historically made that easy. "Your grandmother funded 11 scholarships in 30 years, Fletcher said in the dry tone of a man offering a comparison for calibration rather than critique. "My grandmother was working with what she had when she had it." Rosalyn set the report down. "She always said the right amount is the amount that's actually needed, not the amount that's comfortable to give." Fletcher picked up his wine and said nothing further, which was its own form of agreement. The terrace held the particular quiet of a place where serious things had been decided across several generations, where the stone itself seemed to have absorbed something of the gravity of those decisions and held it as a kind of ambient weight. Rosalyn had sat on this terrace as a child with her parents on evenings like this one, watching the same Atlantic with the uncomplicated attention of a child who does not yet understand that everything she is looking at could be lost. She understood it now. She understood it with a specificity and a completeness that the child could not have accessed, and the understanding did not make the view less beautiful. It made it more true. The folder from the library at Greenwich was open in her mind. The preservation order, the forensic analysis, the name that Fletcher had confirmed last week against the 2008 board records with the quiet, thorough efficiency that characterized everything he did. The name of a person who had been a fixture of the Caldwell institutional world for 30 years. A person who had attended her parents' funeral and expressed condolences to a 22-year-old girl who had been too broken by grief to think clearly about anything, including the arithmetic of who benefited from the absence being mourned. She had not been broken in a long time. She looked at the foundation report in her lap at the 52 names, and she thought about what her grandmother had said about the right amount, not the comfortable amount, but the needed amount. The same principle applied to everything. The needed amount of patience, the needed amount of precision, the needed amount of willingness to continue when continuing was difficult and the outcome was uncertain, and the road ahead was longer than the road already traveled. She had walked into the Westport estate 5 years ago as a woman who had made herself deliberately invisible, who had set aside her name and her resources and her history in the hope of being known purely for what she was. She had been known instead for what she represented to people who understood value only as extraction. She had walked out of that estate in the rain with $6,000 she had left on the desk, not because she needed the money, but because she refused to carry anything out of that house that had been given in contempt. She had walked out of the federal courthouse 6 weeks ago with the accounting closed and the first phase complete and a second chapter already in motion, a chapter with deeper roots and longer stakes, and a name she had not known to look for until the library at Greenwich had taught her to look. The most dangerous assumption she had learned was that a story was over because one chapter had ended cleanly. The people who had shaped her life, who had taken things from it, who had calculated its value and found it useful, and then found it inconvenient and acted accordingly, in both cases had made that assumption about her. Twice. They had looked at a woman who asked for nothing and concluded that a woman who asked for nothing had nothing to fight with. They had been wrong about the asking. They had been wrong about the nothing. And the person who had remained wrong the longest, who had been operating on that assumption for 12 years, while the evidence against it accumulated in a Greenwich library and a federal filing system and a foundation office on the east side of Manhattan, was about to discover that the statute of limitations on certain kinds of wrong had not yet run. Rosalyn Caldwell set the foundation report on the stone table and looked out at the Atlantic and felt beneath the grief and the clarity and the specific grounded solidity of a person who has returned to alignment with herself after a long time off axis, something that was almost peace. Not the peace of completion. The peace of a person who knows exactly where she is, exactly what she is doing, and exactly why it is worth doing, who has no remaining confusion about any of those three things, and therefore no remaining fear. Tomorrow, Fletcher would bring the full documentation on the board member. Tomorrow, the next phase would begin its first methodical step. Tomorrow, the work of a different kind of accounting would open its first page. Tonight, the ocean held its indifferent, enormous patience below the cliff, counting waves the way it had counted them since before anyone now living had been born. And Rosalyn sat with her grandfather's legacy around her, and her grandmother's standard in her hands, and her parents' photograph against her chest in the locket she had worn every day for 12 years, and she was not finished, and she was not afraid, and she was exactly, completely, irrevocably herself. That was enough. For tonight it was more than enough.